Folks, welcome to the live stream. I'm so glad to be here with you today. My name is Steve, and today we're going to be going over the Orbit Eclipse Edition. This is the final version of the Orbit, which is launching next week. And I have so much to go over. I'm not really going to delay with an introduction here. The very first piece of news that I have for you is our drop date. Our initial drop date is 1 week from today, October 27th. It will be dropping at 1 p.m. Eastern. And that is going to go live on our US Acaia website. So what a drop means for us is basically a limited time availability, largely because of a limited inventory availability. For this drop, we are only going to have 30 units to release. This is a bit less than we were expecting. It is a bit unfortunate. To summarize why, it's just kind of comes down to supply chain issues. We also had that announcement last month, where we came upon some parts problems that basically some parts arrived out of spec in terms of how they were manufactured. So they didn't quite have the right fit or function, and that means that we have a reduced quantity available. So unfortunately, we only have 30 units available. These are available only to US buyers. But I do have some good news that I'll get to a little bit later. For now, I'd like to start and just talk about the actual features of the launch version of the Orbit. So I'd like to define first just what Eclipse Edition means. I think we've kind of covered this in some other locations, but Eclipse Edition is just basically the first 500 units of Orbits that we produce. They are sort of a special edition for us because we want to add a little bit of extra reassurance basically to buying a new product. We've obviously never made a grinder before. This is our first grinder. It's something that we do have confidence in, but we want you to have confidence as well. So we want to kind of sweeten the deal a little bit. One of the things that we include in the Eclipse Edition is an extra 6 months of support. So an 18-month total warranty coverage period for Orbit Eclipse Editions. That's for all 500 grinders. We also throw in some swag that I'll get to in just a little bit, but Eclipse Edition is not functionally different from a later standard edition Orbit at this time. There is a possibility that as these Eclipse Edition grinders are built and shipped to customers, they might change somewhat in terms of the internal parts, but we don't expect the functionality to change all that much. It's basically going to be the same product no matter if you're buyer number 300 or buyer number 1300 sometime later next year. The things that might change are probably not very discernible by the end user. It is possible that something comes up in terms of tooling or manufacturing that we have to change some parts or what have you, but again, we are basically planning on keeping the grinder the same functional product from start to finish. Now, let's talk about the actual features of the grinder. It is a 64 millimeter stepless single dosing grinder. The burrs that we are using are made by Mazzer. They're model 33M. These are the same burrs that you would find in the Super Jolly or mini electronic grinders from Mazzer. We're using those burrs basically because we found it to be a good compromise of for one, availability. It's somewhat difficult to find burrs from other manufacturers, especially SSP, but also the flavor we found is actually quite good for the testing and things that we have done. The burrs are mounted inside carriers that we've built. We have this stepless adjustment mechanism on the front. This is a dial that has 750 microns of burr gap adjustment per rotation. It also has 10 numerical markings divided by 10 small ticks. So that means we have 100 markings per rotation. Each marking is 7.5 microns of burr gap adjustment. It is a smoothly continuous adjustment dial. You can turn it basically full revolutions. We don't have quite a maximum revolution that we would recommend necessarily, but somewhere between 2 and 3 will get you to a territory where you're almost too coarse to grind for just about any purpose in terms of coffee brewing. So generally most grind settings will fall in the first 2 rotations of the dial, which means you have access to espresso, filter, course for French press or cold brew or even cupping if you prefer, generally within the first 2 to 3 rotations. For me, I find myself grinding for espresso somewhere between 2 and 3 marks from my touch point on the dial. So it's a fairly good range for espresso, and you have access to pretty fine grind settings as well, straight out of the box. I did mention that this is designed for single dosing, so we can notice that we have a short funnel attached to the top here. We also have a couple of other features that are built in that make this more single dosing friendly. The first is a fairly low retention. When I last cleaned out my Orbit completely, brushed everything out and collected all of those grounds, I had 0.5 grams of coffee residue. And that is caked into various parts in the actual burrs themselves, in small recesses here and there. Generally, that kind of retention is not a dose-to-dose retention. So if I put 18 grams in my funnel, I get 18 grams back out the spout. That is just the total kind of compacted retention inside the grinder. The other thing that we have that makes single dose quite nice is a spout with a spring-loaded knocking mechanism, which I'll click for you here. That actually helps clear basically the last 1/10 to 2/10 of a gram of coffee dust that might be stuck in the spout area. So again, if I put 18 grams in and let's say I get 17.8 out, I can give the knocker a couple of knocks and that will release that final couple of 1/10 of a gram. Overall, we've pretty much focused on making this a very functional single dosing grinder from the get-go, because we know that that's something that's appealing to quite a lot of home espresso users, as well as commercial users. The Orbit is not necessarily positioned as a total commercial replacement grinder. You know, you wouldn't necessarily put this on your bar in place of an EK43 or a Peak or some other, full-duty espresso grinder, but you might use it as an accessory grinder for single origin espresso or a guest filter coffee or something like that. We do think that it is light duty commercial capable, and we're excited to see who might put it to use in their cafes. Now the funnel itself holds about 40 grams of beans. That does depend on your bean size and density, but that's inclusive of the funnel and the chute down into the burrs. It should hold around 40 grams of beans. Again, for single dosing, you might only load maybe 15 to 20 grams at a time, depending on what you're actually using this for. And now I'll also talk about some of the other functions that we have built in, including the RPM presets. So I'll turn this grinder toward the cameras a little bit so you can see better. On the front, we have just a single button. If I push this button and wake up the grinder, you'll see that it's lit now with a blue light. This, for my grinder, is the middle setting. This is 1,000 RPMs. We have an adjustment available from 600 to 1,500 RPM. And by default, the presets that arrive on a factory calibrated grinder, you'll have 600, 1,000, and 1,500 RPMs are your first 3 presets. So to change my preset, I just hold that button for about 1 second, and you'll see that it changes color. And I'll cycle through again, and now we're back to setting number 2, which again is that 1,000 RPM. This is configurable. If you would like to change your RPM setting in your presets, you can connect to the Orbit app, which allows you to configure the settings for your Orbit. It also allows you to set up things like grind by time and grind by weight. We'll get to the app a little bit later in this presentation, but just so you're aware, if you prefer not to grind at 1,000 RPMs, for example, you could set this to 750 or 1,200. Again, that total range is 600 to 1,500, and you can set that in increments of 50 to whatever you prefer. Now, why would you change RPM? That's a good question. I think generally the general knowledge about RPM in terms of grinding is that it does have an effect on grind uniformity. If you were to grind 2 coffees at the same exact grind setting, so the burrs are the same exact distance apart, and one is at 1,600 RPM, the other is at 1,500 RPM, there is likely going to be a change in particle uniformity. That is perhaps a little hard to qualify, but you would see it, if you're pulling espresso, for example, you would see it in a difference of flow rate and shot time. Whether or not one is better than the other is totally subjective. You might decide that you prefer to grind very fast. You might decide that you prefer to grind fast for certain roast levels and slow for other roast levels. So there's quite a lot of variability, and that's why we wanted it to be a user adjustable parameter. We want to give you an option so you can fine-tune those settings as you prefer. Now, I'd like to start right off and just give you an espresso grinding demo so you get a sense of how fast we grind, how fine we grind, and what the espresso quality looks like. So I will turn this slightly. The coffee that I'm going to be using for this demonstration is roasted by Say. They are an American roaster based in Brooklyn, New York, and they are considered a fairly light roaster by American standards. I wanted to use a light coffee because this is kind of how we have been stress testing the Orbits. Our typical calibration coffee is Finca Tamana by Tim Wendelboe, the Finca Tamana Espresso specifically. That's a fairly light Nordic-style light roast coffee. And when you use a light roast, a very dense coffee, you kind of put more demand on the grinder. You force it to, well, for one, there's a lot more torque in grinding light roast coffees. They're denser. Sometimes they pack more closely together, which means that the burrs have to turn harder and faster in order to get the initial spin up in terms of how the burrs process that coffee. So it's more demanding on the burrs, on the motor, on the overall grinder as a whole. That's why we wanted to go with these light roast coffees as kind of a demonstration. So Say, actually, I quite prefer their coffees. I enjoy them quite a lot. This is a Colombia washed geisha coffee. It is about a month and change old, which is a good amount of wet rest time for Say. They typically recommend around 4 weeks of rest before enjoying. And again, it is a fairly dense light roast coffee. So I will be loading 18 grams of whole beans directly into my funnel, -1. And from there, I'll just continue my normal prep. So I'm on setting 2. All I have to do to start this up is push the button once. Now that the grinding is finished, it's going to auto-purge. That auto-purge happens for all single dosing grind cycles. When it's sensed that the load on the burrs and the motor has diminished, it will continue for a couple of seconds, stop the motor, spin in reverse, and then spin back forward. And that auto-purge function helps to clear a lot of the retained coffee. Spinning reverse and forward helps to dislodge coffee that might be stuck on the wipers or various other parts inside the grinder, and it helps really clear the retention. If I wanted to, I can actually triple tap the front button and run an auto purge cycle again. Let's say I'm not convinced that all the coffee grounds just came out, I can run it again. And now I'll also give my chute a little tap. You probably saw the extra little bit of residue come out of there. And now we have my full 18-gram dose, which I'll add to my portafilter. The prep that I've done here, I did add a paper filter to the bottom of my basket. That's just a step that I prefer. This is not necessary for using the Orbit. I'm basically setting up an espresso shot the way that I prefer to make them. So I'll put a paper filter on the bottom, and I'm going to use a needle tool, a WD-2 tool, just to give a little bit of a stir and even out that bed of grounds. There we are, nice and quick. And one quick tap, and then I will tamp right here. And now before I actually go ahead and pull this shot, I'm going to set up a second camera for YouTube, and then I will pull the camera, the phone camera a little bit closer to me. So bear with me one moment. I want you to be able to see this shot of espresso. Okay, here we are. That looks pretty good to me. And then YouTube, let me switch my camera really quick. There we are. Okay. Now I will lock in. So I'm going to use my lunar and little cup under here. This is a flow profiling machine, so what I'm going to do is start at a very high flow rate just to soak the top of the puck and then reduce that flow rate to let it sit for a second. And then as my pressure starts to build, I'll return to full flow. So now I'm letting that puck suck. I'm looking, I'm looking at a shot mirror to see the saturation on the bottom of the basket. And now I've increased my flow rate. When we do our dial-in for our espressos with these light roast coffees, what we're looking for is 18 grams in the basket to 50 grams out in the cup in around 30 to 35 seconds. I went just a little bit over, but in 35 seconds I had 51 grams. So that is a technically standard shot of espresso for us. Give it just a little stir here. Such a wonderful coffee. It's really, really peachy. That's my favorite part. You know, it's getting cold here, but I love a good sort of fresh peach character. I will switch my cameras back now, and we'll talk a little bit more about the grinder. Okay. There we are. And YouTube. Can't forget you. There we go. All right, so now I've pulled a shot of espresso for you. You've seen, the time to grind. Time to grind does change based on the coffees that you're using, the burrs that you have installed, and of course the grind RPM. With the Mazzer burrs, that middle 1000 RPM, for an 18 gram dose, as fine as I'm grinding it, I think that took around maybe 25 seconds or so. I didn't time it, of course. If you use other coffees, in particular less dense coffees, maybe you prefer medium roasts rather than these American light roasts, you'll probably have a shorter time to grind. You'll probably also grind a little bit more coarsely than I have here. And again, I've also mentioned you might be using a different burr set. We are using a 64 millimeter burr platform that allows us to use other burrs from other manufacturers. We have tested a number of burrs. The ones that we are fairly assured of are SSP burrs, including the multi-purpose burrs and the cast version 2 burrs. I've personally put a number of sets in the grinders that I've used over the past year. I can't vouch for all of them. Sometimes we have encountered issues where perhaps they don't really feed the way that we expect. Occasionally there will be what we consider a feed stall, where the burrs are not quite grabbing the beans correctly. But that is just sort of par for the course in this kind of realm, where you're creating a grinder that might be adaptable for other burr sets, but you cannot vouch for every burr set under the sun. So we have a few that we are fairly assured with and that we can recommend. With others, it might be, use at your own discretion. We can't necessarily account for how they will perform. And in some cases, they might only perform as a filter burr set rather than an espresso burr set. Again, just because of the way that they might feed the beans into the burrs or out from the burrs. So just to reiterate, the SSP multi-purpose and cast burrs, version 2 cast burrs, are both burrs that we've tested and can confirm do work with this grinder. Now, the next item on my list was to actually talk about what comes with the Eclipse Edition grinder. I mentioned that we do have a bit of swag that comes with the grinder, so I'd like to walk through just a quick sort of unboxing experience. Inside the box, you'll of course find your Orbit. There will be a power cable wrapped and detached in the carton. You will get a 58 millimeter portafilter dosing cup. This is our dosing cup medium, and that comes with every Orbit. You'll also get this little accessories box, and inside the accessories box is a magnetic foot, just like this. You might have noticed that my portafilter cup will magnetically attach itself just below the spout. We have, what I think you can see here is this little spout extender. I quite like that, actually. I prefer to use it whether I'm using a portafilter dosing cup like this. or another container. I like that spout extender quite a lot. But it does just clip on. You can take it off if you don't prefer it. Inside the accessory box, of course, we also have a number of small items. So we have some thumb screws, which can be attached to the back of the spout in place of the Phillips head screws. These are handy if you prefer to take your spout off for cleaning frequently. You can just use the thumb screws instead of trying to use a Phillips head screw there. That's not totally necessary, but some people like to clean their grinders quite frequently. We do have a hex wrench that is used for these screws on the side sort of posts of the attachment of the front cap here. There's these two little strips, which I'll show you. They attach right to the bottom of the lunar on either side. It's probably a little hard to see because this is a black lunar, but we have one here and one here, left and right side. And that allows our lunar to attach to the magnetic base plate on the orbit itself. That's for grind by weight, which we'll get to in just a moment. And that is it for this small accessories box. We also have a slightly larger sort of documents kit. And this includes the Quick Start Guide, which is a pamphlet that gives you a bunch of information, just basic information about running the grinder. This is a shorter version, kind of a companion to the actual full product manual, which we include as a PDF on the website. So you can find that on the web. We also have this paper template. This paper template is used to attach the magnetic strips to the base of your lunar. It lines up. You can see there's cutouts here for the actual magnetic strips themselves, the two screws on the bottom of the lunar, and then there's two tabs that insert in between the two sort of shells of your lunar to hold this firmly in place. And of course, what kit could be complete without some stickers? Finally, and I should actually mention, everything I've shown you so far is part of the standard Orbit kit. This is not the Eclipse Edition swag, so every Orbit comes with these tools. In addition, we got some swag. So we have a limited edition Orbit Eclipse Edition hat. Pretty nice. Actually, I have an older Akai hat from the same company that I really love, so I hope you guys love these hats. We also got a couple of other nice items made. We have some letterpress thank you cards. There's a bit of information here on submitting thoughts and feedback for Eclipse Edition Orbit owners. We also have a custom enamel pin to commemorate the launch of the Orbit. Eclipse Edition buyers also get a 53mm dosing cup. I use these. You actually saw me use one already for dosing my beans. They're really great for that, but also if you have a smaller portafilter, this is useful for grinding in and dosing for a smaller portafilter such as Breville or I think Delacorte and a few others have that smaller 54mm set. If you have a dosing funnel and something like a La Pavoni, a 49 or 51mm basket, this also does work, but you would want a funnel just because of the fit on top of the basket. We also get an anti-static brush. These are pretty nice. They're fairly sturdy. It's just a steel brush, I think horsehair, and they're nice and anti-static, which is great for cleaning off any residue from your spouts. And the final item that I don't have, unfortunately, is a way to brew notebook, which is really nice for recording your grind settings, your shot times, etc. Just logging your brews with the various coffees that you have. So we have a nice little swag kit. That will be shipping separately from the Eclipse Edition grinders. So those are packed and shipped in Portland, where our U.S. headquarters is, while the Orbits themselves will be shipping from our fulfillment center in California. So they do arrive in separate shipments, just to give you a heads up. All right. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the more technical features that we have. I've mentioned grind by weight already. I think one question that's burning in everybody's mind when I mention grind by weight is, why does a single dose grinder have grind by weight in the first place? The short answer is just versatility. It is built into the grinder. You do not have to use it. Your grinder arrives grind by weight ready, but if you're a dedicated single doser, it's optional. You don't have to use it. However, I will say, I like to use grind by weight even with the short funnel because it's very useful for dialing in a coffee. If you get into that kind of repetitive measure a dose, pour it into the grinder, put it into your portafilter, etc., and you do that 3 or 4 or 8 times to dial in a brand new coffee, well, guess what? Grind by weight is really useful, provided you have the lunar already. So if I want to do grind by weight, I'll turn on my lunar. Once my lunar's on, my orbit's on, I just put the scale on the platform, and in about 1 second, 1 to 2 seconds, it connects automatically. You'll see orbit flash on the display, and now we have, on the left side, we have the RPM, and on the right, we have our target grind weight. So all I need to do to change either of those is long press the tare button, and then my power on the left and my tare on the right become like decrease and increase respectively. So power is decrease, tare is increase. It will basically cycle through our weight and then RPM for this setting. So I will long press tare. I can tap the tare button to increase, tap the power to decrease, and then wait a moment, and it will cycle to RPM instead. Tap the tare to increase, tap the power to decrease, and then after a moment, it will save those settings in the scale. You can do this for all 3 of those presets. You can set the RPM, you can set the weight for all 3, basically the ABC preset. You can do that on the scale or in the app. It's very, very quick to do, I think. And then from there, let's say I want to just grind a bunch of 18-gram coffees. I can just open my bag, top up the funnel, continuously grind, make small changes to my grind setting, and pull shots. If I want to continue using my lunar as my shot scale, I just pull it off, and in about 1 second, it reverts back to espresso mode. So it's very quick to change back and forth. You know, so once again, about 1 second, and it's flashed back to orbit mode. So this grind by weight feature is useful for even people who enjoy doing single dosing primarily. Again, if you're just dialing in that fresh bag of coffee, you can use the lunar, grind by weight, just use that for dial in, and then you don't really have to worry about it anymore. I also think, I haven't done it myself, but if you're entertaining, let's say you have people over for brunch or an after meal espresso or something like that, and you need to make 5 or 6 coffees pretty quickly, that's another great function. You just push the front button and it starts to grind, and it will hit within about 1/10 of a gram of your desired dose without having to do anything. Now the retention is a little bit higher in grind by weight mode. So if you are leaving beans in the funnel and inside the grinder, you will have kind of partially processed pieces and a little bit more dust. So I would recommend, and in my experience this works rather well, just grind about 1 to 2 grams of purge coffee if you're coming back to it after a few hours. If you're only grinding by weight for a single session for a dial-in, for example, you don't really need to worry too much about a purge. Now, let's also talk about the app very quickly. I've mentioned a few of those features, and I'll show you a little bit here. So, I have my app open. This is on an iPhone. With my Orbit on, I can connect to the Orbit. We're connected now. And as I mentioned before, we have a few different configuration settings available to us. On my Orbit screen, you'll see a number of features. There's these 3 green buttons. There is an RPM readout. This is a live RPM readout. There's a live weight readout as well. That would assume that I have a lunar scale also connected. And then down here we have a graph, and that graph will show us the target RPM for that preset as well as the live RPM. So the way that we've tuned our programming in the Orbit, it tries to stick as closely as possible to the desired RPM. So let's say it's 1000 RPM. You will see this graph basically chart a ramp up as it starts from 0, tries to hit RPM or 1000 and tries to stay at 1000 through the course of grinding. That is going to be a bit variable. Processing coffee kind of is pretty variable. It's not super consistent, but you will see basically this line sort of wavering around that target line. In my experience, it tends to be pretty good. Again, there's like that little ramp up, maybe a couple of little spikes, and then it kind of hones in and stays there. So I'm very impressed with that. In other grinders that have RPM control, they may, and I don't want to make any like accusations here, but they may basically have a set power being delivered to the motor that doesn't require that the motor stay at that RPM. It's just delivering power equivalent to a certain RPM. So when the coffee beans are loaded into the burrs, it can drop the RPM because there's an excess load, and then it will slowly come back up to that desired RPM. Where what we're trying to do is hit and stick to that RPM as quickly as possible in the grind cycle. We'll also see at the bottom there is 4 buttons, A, B, C, and M. A, B, and C are the preset profiles that I've mentioned so far. M is a manual control. So what that allows us to do, it enables this slider up here. So when I turn my grinder on, and I'll put my dosing cup underneath. When I turn my grinder on, I can drag the RPM slider up and down to vary the RPM in real time. And we will also see that graphed basically down here as it goes. That is a pretty interesting feature, I think. It's not something that I've personally experimented with a whole ton yet. But what it would allow you to do is very similar to like a potentiometer dial or something like that on another variable RPM grinder. It allows you to change it in real time should that be something you're interested in. One thing that might be interesting is, for example, doing a very long, slow ramp up or long, slow ramp down in RPM to sort of see how that changes your dynamics of your ground coffee. As I mentioned before, the RPM of a grinder can influence the grind uniformity. So if you change your RPM in real time, you might kind of dynamically change that uniformity in a way that makes tastier coffee. So that's available to you in the manual grind setting. I should also mention that we have these 3 buttons in the middle. The leftmost is like a quick spin sort of purge, if you like. This is useful if you just need to, like, let's say you're using grind by time and you just need to top up another 1/10 of a gram. You can just hit that button and it'll spin burrs up very quickly. The center button is just the start-stop, so I can start and stop the grinder manually, and I can do that in all 3 presets. And then the final rightmost button is that purge function that I've mentioned already. So just one tap, it will spin backwards and then spin forwards at 2000 RPM. And then finally, just to kind of go over how we actually configure our settings here. So if I select A, B, or C, my presets, there is a little slider menu at the top right. We can go in here, we can change our RPM target, we can change our target weight if a lunar is connected, so that allows us to change the grind by weight setting. We can also enable RPM profiling, and what that does is it allows us to set a start RPM and an end RPM. So for example, I can start at 600 and finish at 1200. And what I can do is I can set the time for each stage. So if I want to grind 600 RPMs for 5 seconds and then grind the remaining at 1200 RPM for 15 seconds, I can set that up, and you'll basically get another graph here showing you the start phase and RPM and the end phase and RPM, and it will ramp up between the two after each stage is completed. And again, that gets into the dynamics of changing your RPM and how that affects the actual grind uniformity. So these connected features add a lot of kind of extensible functionality to the Orbit itself. They're totally optional. When you get the grinder, you unpack it out of the box, you plug it in, and you're ready to go. You can just go ahead and use it. But if you'd like to access some of the other features, the app is free. You just connect it to your phone, and now you can change and configure things as you like. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is the alignment function. So we've gotten quite a lot of questions about alignment. I think that makes a lot of sense. This sort of grinder category of these 64 millimeter grinders is very, there's a lot of people that are interested in burr alignment. So as I mentioned last year in our demonstration, we have what we're calling alignment screws, which are on the bottom of the rotating burr carrier. They oppose the mounting screws that are on the face of the burr. So these screws hold the burr down, and the alignment screws change the plane under the burr by pushing against the bottom of the burr itself. That allows you to change your burr alignment just with a twist of a screw. You don't need to use shim stock. You don't need to find shim stock. And you can basically just very slightly tweak these screws and get a much better alignment out of your burrs. The stationary carrier, which I have here, the stationary carrier does not currently have those alignment screws. That's something that we're investigating. It's a little bit more tricky to machine into this carrier, but it might be possible. If you do feel you need to adjust the plane of your stationary burr, you would do that with shim material at present. If it does change in the future, we'll definitely let everybody know that the alignment is possible with screws instead of shims. Now, the alignment that we're trying to achieve from factory takes a little bit of describing. Rather than try and say, we want to achieve 10 micron runout or something like that, we wanted a way to be able to do this in our factory in a controlled but efficient manner, basically. So we have tools and jigs that allow us to measure our burrs and how well aligned they are, but we also use sort of qualitative metrics for how well alignment might be without having to use those tools, if that makes sense. So one metric we're using is the distance between the 0 point, where the burrs are fully locked together. So if you could imagine these two burrs are fully making contact surface to surface. That is the 0 or the lock point. The distance between that and the first touch point, which is the point where those burrs, as you're adjusting finer and running the motor, they make an audible noise of physical contact. The distance between those two, our factory standard is basically between 2 and 2.5 steps, which is between, I think, 150 and like 170 microns, which is a very, very small distance. That's the thickness of like a few human hairs. If a grinder is compliant, that means that those 2 points are within 2 to 2.5 marks on the dial. In general, some of them have actually come out better than that, but that point is basically the point that also agrees with our espresso test that I mentioned. Grinding 18 grams of a light roast coffee and achieving a 50-gram yield is espresso within 30 to 35 seconds. That 2 to 2.5 range easily achieves it pretty much every time. Again, as I said, we do have other measurement metrics for achieving that, but the main thing that we want users and buyers to take away is that something that they can repeat at home is the 0 point and the touch point are within 2 to 2.5 numbers on the dial. So that's something when you open the box, you'll have a mark on your dial that indicates the factory touch point, and you can find the 0 point as well, and they should be between 2 to 2.5 marks on the dial. Also, you should be able to grind a light roast coffee and get that 18 to 50 out. If it's much, much lighter than Tim Wendelboe, it might be a little bit more difficult to achieve, but Tim Wendelboe is a pretty good example of a light roast coffee. There are definitely other lighter coffees out there, but again, so that is the basic alignment metric we're trying to achieve. If you are the type to open a grinder and you want to achieve better alignment, it's possible. Again, we have those alignment screws, and then in the case of the stationary burr, you might need to place a shim or two. Generally, we're finding that that's not necessary. Finally, a few people have asked about accessories. So the main thing that we have available right now is just this magnetic dosing cup. We do have a magnet roughly directly below the spout. So if you were to have some other accessory, some other dosing cup, and indeed this the magnetic pad that we include is not pre-attached to our dosing cup. So if you have a different cup or a different item that you would prefer to attach there, you can put the magnetic pad on whatever you like and have it aligned beneath the spout. I can confirm that we have been working on R&D for a portafilter cradle. We don't have an ETA on that yet. That is something that's still kind of in progress, and priority, of course, has been focusing on the grinder itself and making sure that that is ready to ship. So that is probably delayed somewhat. The large hopper, there's been a lot of questions about that. Unfortunately, will not be available this year. Part of that, again, is just the focus on making sure that the grinder parts are all correct and ready, and we have a functioning grinder. So our resources have been pulled just on focusing on the grinder itself, and unfortunately not accessories. So the larger hopper, it will hold around 250 grams of beans, but it will not be ready until probably the first quarter of next year at some point. All right, so that concludes my presentation here so far. I want to just cover the drop system again. Our first drop of grinders will be 30 units. They'll be available to U.S. buyers only next week, 1 week from today, at 1 p.m. on October 27th. The grinders themselves ship from our fulfillment center in California. We will also be including a free swag kit for Eclipse buyers for the first 500 grinders. Those will ship from Portland, so they do ship separately. Just to explain the U.S. restriction, this is mainly a support concern. This is our first grinder. We're very confident in our ability to make a good functioning grinder, but we also know that even with time-tested products, sometimes things go wrong. So our U.S. support team is the one that is set up and best ready to fully support this grinder. So we're excluding international purchases at this time. Once those 500 Eclipse units are worked through, we will transition to a standard edition. And once the standard edition is out, I don't have an actual ETA, but once the standard edition is out, that will basically be when we begin to roll out to other countries and other distributions. So sometime in 2023, the standard edition Orbit will be available to buyers in the EU, in Asia, elsewhere. So unfortunately, I'm very, very sorry that it's limited availability at this time. I see a good question. That's 1 p.m. Eastern time. That is correct. So 10 a.m. Pacific. And that is on the Orbit, or that will be on the Orbit page as well. So we'll let everybody know when they can expect the drop to go live. All right, from here, I have a pretty healthy list of user questions. So let me grab this sheet real quick. I'm going to be going over these Q&A, and then we've also been collecting some questions in the Instagram chat. So I'm going to run down the list. I've answered some of these already, but so alignment, how will it be aligned from factory? I've already covered. That 0 point to touch point is the best sort of heuristic for what your alignment expectations might be. That is with the Mazar 33M burrs. It's possible it will change with the SSP burrs that we hope to offer later on. What burrs are available, and will SSP burrs be offered? So the answer is yes, we do plan to offer SSP multi-purpose burrs as a standard installed burr set with the Orbit. That will be in the future. It will probably be maybe December at the earliest. We don't have a commitment to that right now, just because, again, it's really a matter of making sure that we are able to build and ship grinders just at this point. So after that has kind of spun up and we feel more confident with production, we can move into offering the multi-purpose burrs. Now, actually, I should say the multi-purpose burrs and the cast version 2 burrs from SSP are compatible with our burr carriers. So if you have a set or wish to purchase them aftermarket, you can install them yourself. So I've already answered a question about the hopper. There's sort of a tie-in here is, will the buyers of the Eclipse Drop get the larger hopper when it's released? That is not a plan of ours. It's going to be an optional accessory that you would purchase after the fact. Again, why is grind by weight included? Really, it's just offering another feature. It is totally optional to you if you are somebody who prefers single dosing. We wanted to make sure that this grinder is functional for a variety of different people. Not everybody likes to single dose. Some people prefer to just load up a bag of coffee at a time, or at least have a more streamlined workflow, and grind by weight can offer that. So it's totally optional. If you're not interested in it, you don't have to use it. Is a burless option available? That is a no. We are not going to offer a burless option of the Orbit at this time. They will all come pre-installed with either the Mazar burrs or perhaps down the line the SSP multi-purpose burrs. What is the adjustment per tick? I've covered that as well. We have 100 ticks per rotation, and a 750 micron range per rotation, so each tick is 7.5 microns. And that's just the burr distance and not the actual grind output. That's much too complicated to get into here. Retention I have covered as well. As I said, the last time I cleaned mine out, it was right around 0.5 gram, totally like swept and picked of all the channels and crevices and everything like that. So generally the retention is quite low, under 0.5 gram of total compacted retention. How loud is it? I believe we kind of already covered that by grinding. Some folks have asked how it compares to the P64. I say it is louder than the P64. I don't think it is ear-shattering loud or anything like that, but it is louder than the P64 specifically. I don't really have other grinders that I can compare that to, unfortunately. When will it release elsewhere? Again, it's US only for now. The best that we can say is that sometime in 2023 there will be a wider outside the US release. Now, the support for the Lunars. The Lunar 2021 will be supported out of the gate. It will be basically firmware compatible. What you'll do is you'll update your lunar firmware, and then it will be compatible with the orbit itself. The original Lunar, the pre-2021 Lunar, will be supported later this year. I think we're thinking December, but it does take a little bit more time to do that. The app itself, the mobile app, will be iOS to start. That's going to be ready next week. Android will take a little bit longer because we have to make sure that it's compatible with many different devices. So I think that might also be December. Have you finalized what colors will be available? The starting color is just this space gray color. We have heard requests for other different colors, everything from white to hot pink. So we'll be happy to entertain other colors in the future. So look for that news later on. So grind range was a question that a few people have had, like will it grind for cupping, will it grind for what have you. I will say the grind range, the actual physical adjustment that is available to us from fine to coarse, does have quite a lot of range. You can grind basically up to like 2,000 micron like chunks of coffee. The amount of particle-sized adjustment per rotation depends on the burrs, but with the Mazzer burrs, generally 2 to 3 revolutions of the dial gets you to like a very coarse grind setting that is not going to be all that useful for most applications. Okay, so there is a question about motor power, and this is something that is a bit technical. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but basically the question is, we've got a 200 watt brushless DC motor in our grinder, and 200 watts is a lower wattage than some other grinders. So how is it able to process coffee? I hope that I've demonstrated that it can handle lightly roasted coffee at an espresso setting pretty well by grinding that say for espresso and getting that target time that I mentioned. But I can also say, and in fact, maybe if I pull this up, I know I ran the grinder already, so this might not show accurately. In the app, you can actually get a report of the last grind session's wattage, and that's an average wattage for the whole grind session. So you can see, for example, unfortunately, it's not available to me because I was using that pulse function. But for example, in other grind sessions, I've hit basically like 100 to 115 watts for grinding a light roast coffee and espresso. So we are below the maximum wattage of the motor. Again, we're adjusting our motor driver basically to achieve what we need it to do as a coffee grinder. That allows us to actually be a little bit more efficient than some other motors. I don't want to speak for any other coffee grinder. I will just say that 200 watts is totally sufficient for all of the coffees that we've put through it to date. Can we easily swap the burrs? So the burrs themselves are held with 3 mounting screws. This is pretty typical of 64 millimeter burrs. Ours are an M5 Phillips head screw. Some burrs would take an M4 screw, so we will actually have a set of M4 screws in the package. I didn't mention that before, but we'll have a set of M4 screws available in case the M5s are too large for the actual burr screw holes in whatever set you're using. But these are compatible with the Mazzer burrs and the SSP burrs that I've mentioned. Installing burrs is something that I would recommend somebody does if they have some experience or at least some technical know-how, because it isn't necessarily as simple as screwing them into place, because again, alignment matters, and you might need to be the kind of person who has some patience to do some testing to figure out how well your burrs are aligned just screwed down, as well as make those adjustments to changing the alignment. If you don't think that you're confident that you have that patience, I wouldn't recommend trying to change burrs, or at least I would recommend trying to get some help for it. It is sometimes a very tedious process that it tests even my patience, and I've been doing this for quite some years now. So it is easy enough to change the burrs, but I think you have to have, you want to be prepared for what's to come. And I think the final question, actually I have a few more. So another sort of follow-up question to that is, will you design a burr carrier like the EG1? And I believe that means using blind burrs, which have no screw holes in them. I can say we do not have a plan for that at this time. Another question here is basically how much can you feed into the funnel? Could you continue to fill up the funnel if you want? So let's say you want to grind 100 grams of coffee instead of 40 through this funnel. You totally can. Yeah. Our recommended duty cycle is, I believe, 60 seconds on and 30 seconds off. So as long as you're trying to maintain that, and that's just to allow some time for the motor to cool, the PCB to cool, just give it some time to cool in between grinding sessions. So an extended one is not that much of a problem. And the final question that I have here is about the power. So our stated power is 120 to 240 volts on 50 to 60 hertz. Yes, that is by default in this one orbit. The power supply that we have included is dual voltage capable. However, when we ship out to our US buyers, you will be getting a 120 volt rated power cable, so it wouldn't be compatible necessarily in a 240 volt environment. Now, I believe I have some questions that were submitted via Instagram. Let me cover those. If I could open my phone. All right. So, what's the clearance under the spout with the lunar on? We do have a measurement of this. I don't know offhand, but I can kind of show you here. So if I put my lunar down and my dosing cup down, well, I do have the spout adapter, but if I put my lunar down and my dosing cup down, that's plenty of clearance for the spout itself. If I am using the spout extender, which I don't really need to do if it's this high, you would just need to tilt the cup to get it on underneath the extended spout, like so. But again, that isn't really necessary. The spout extender is helpful for cutting down on any sort of static spray that might be happening. You'll probably also notice I didn't do a water spray or an RDT, Ross droplet technique, on my beans. I don't generally recommend that for this. Partly it's because the little bits of moisture in our grind path can cause the beans to kind of get slowed down and maybe they don't completely feed. If it's something that you really need to do because of your area being excessively dry or something like that, I would suggest using the wet spoon technique rather than a spray of water. It should achieve a very similar effect without having the excess kind of droplets of water on the beans. We have covered the purge function, so as I've mentioned before, at the end of a single dose grinding session, this is not the case with time grinding and grind by weight, for reasons I hope are obvious. If you were to purge while in those settings, you would just grind a lot of excess coffee. But with a single dose, in single dose mode, we have an auto purge that spins both reverse and forward at 2000 RPM to help clear the excess coffee and kind of fling that out the spout. Does the app show what grind setting you're on? That's a great question. We do not have a digital output of grind setting. And I actually should also talk about the fact that the way that our adjustment is set up, We do not have a zero burr at zero on the dial sort of system. Some other grinders do have that. They have a way to adjust the numerical scale to make sure that zero with the burrs is zero on the dial. We don't have that, unfortunately. So we're going to mark the factory touch point where the burrs make physical contact on the dial. So when you receive your orbit, you know where that is. And then from there, you can basically adjust as needed. If you ever need to find the touch point again, let's say you've taken your burrs out for cleaning, installed new ones, or maybe you just you got a rock in your beans and you needed to pull that out of the grinder. What you'll do is start with clean burrs. You will set the burrs, after you've installed them again, you'll set them so there's a visible gap, and then turn the motor on and very, very slowly adjust the dial until you hear an audible noise of contact. And we just finished shooting a video that demonstrates this, basically. So you'll adjust the grind until you just hear it make contact, and that's your new touch point. So from there, you can adjust just however you need. So to reiterate, each small tick is 7.5 microns. There's 100 ticks per rotation, so 750 microns total. So for something like espresso, you would grind about maybe 1 to 2 whole numbers from your touch point, as an example. And here's a question about back-to-back espresso, as well as, I'm sorry, actually, the meat of the question is how much retention is there when you switch from espresso to filter grinding and back. So this is something that is relatively common with grinders, is when you grind for espresso, you grind these particles much finer, and there's a lot of dust, and that gets compacted into the burrs. And then if you were to set the grind coarser and try to grind for filter coffee, you'll have a lot of excess dust that comes out in that dose. I will say there is definitely some dust. As I've mentioned, the retention that I've experienced is typically around or a little bit below 1/2 of a gram. I'm using mine primarily for espresso, so I kind of extrapolate that as what your carryover might be if you switch from espresso to filter. I don't have a good way to say exactly how much sort of fine coffee particles make their way into a filter brew, but I would basically say, yeah, probably around 1/2 gram. And in my experience, that does change the character of the brew a little bit, but it's not an excessive amount of fine coffee. It's something where you might just grind a little bit more coarse, or just basically adapt your recipe to assume that there's a little bit of extra fine material in the mix. Or, for example, just purge a gram or so, and that will help clear out a lot of that excess coffee. That is a little bit of waste for sure. For my purposes, I tend to just deal with the extra little bit of fines. So here's a question about the Eclipse being dual voltage capable. The technical answer is that yes. The power supply inside the grinder is capable of being run on 120 to 240 volt power. For the Eclipse Edition, I can't recommend that, basically. The intent of the Eclipse Edition is to be the first run of grinders that, again, we're offering extended support for, as well as some other swag items and things. Partly because we want to be sure that production of orbits goes smoothly and that customer support is as exceptional as we can make it for those early adopters. That becomes more tricky if it is removed from the US. Our typical RMA policy for all of our products is that you return the product to where it was purchased. And in the case of the Orbit, the US support team is basically the only one which will have parts and replacements and knowledge ready to go for Orbit support, because that's where we focused our training. So if you take an Eclipse out of the country and go to a 240 volt situation, it will technically work. I would say don't make that your plan. If you're going on a trip or something, that's fine, as long as you can get it back to the US. If you were to buy in the US and have it shipped to you in France or something, and there's a problem, it has to come back to the US for support. So we really, really don't want to encourage people to take it outside the US, if at all possible. I think I had one more just come in. We have reached the top of the hour, so this will be the last sort of question here. Is there a possibility of getting some stickers to put on the adjustment wheel to indicate touch or favorite grinds? Actually, I totally forgot to show you our detent ring. You might be able to see here, I have two distinct rings. The lower ring is the actual grind adjustment. That's stepless. That can be turned left and right to adjust your grind. The ring on top of it is what we call the detent ring. If I turn this, you might hear it click. So that has 120 clicks per rotation. It spins freely from the adjustment dial itself. What I have used it for, I have a little triangle indicator here. I align that with my touch point, my burr touch point. And then when I turn my dial, I grab both rings at the same time and kind of spin them. Allow me to move this a little bit closer so you can see. So I'll adjust the angle here. And apologies to YouTube. There will be a video on YouTube that actually shows these both. But when I turn this dial, you might be able to see this little triangle right here. When I turn this dial and I grab both at the same time, I keep that triangle pointed to my 0 point. Now you could actually change that. You can set the position to a different, like let's say, actually I want that to be on my last grind setting. So when I make an adjustment, I can say, okay, so I'm adjusting from 9, and I want to try 9.4 and see what that does. I can come back to 9 now because I have my indicator there and say, that's where I ground last. So that tasted better. Let's stick to that. So you can use that to set a preferred grind setting. Now there are also other marks on the detent ring. There's a triangle and a circle as just sort of, kind of non-specific indicators. You just use whatever you want. But then we also have a sort of an indicator system. So there's it's just a helper diagram to let you know which direction you turn the dial to grind finer or coarser. So we have a small dot over here progressing to a large dot. Basically that's saying if you turn the dial to the left, you go coarser. If you turn it to the right, you go finer. So that detent ring is multifunctional. You can use it for whatever you like. As I mentioned, there's 120 clicks per rotation, and it spins freely from the actual adjustment ring. So you can use the detent ring for whatever you like. All right, that is going to wrap it up for today. I hope that this has been helpful, and I want to take a moment just to thank you all for coming to hang out. It's been a journey. It's been about a year since our first actual demonstration with the prototype Orbit. So we've come a long way. We've made a number of changes, and it's so exciting to finally release the Orbit. So that again is next week. Our very first drop in the US will be October 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern. 30 units only, unfortunately. There will be subsequent drops, hopefully between 2 and 3 weeks later, and then kind of 2 to 3 weeks after each. But we will make those announcements when we have more sure dates. So we're hoping for around 3 more drops this year, and then in 2023 going into regular production and having a ton of these available. So once again, thank you all so much for attending. It's been lovely. If you have any other questions, please feel free to shoot us a message on Instagram or Twitter or wherever. You can send us an email as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you again for attending. We will have comments go live once that is published to our channel a little bit later this week. So thanks very much, everybody. See you soon.